Could you talk about all the people who claimed to be Elijah before William Branham and where they got that idea from?
The Elijah study, it's actually related to the previous question, Charles. Without British Israelism, you can't have this Elijah notion. You have to take the passages of biblical text that applied to the Jews, and you have to twist it into the 20th century. And so everything that we said in the last question really is the same as this question, because it's ripped out of context, and there were other people. One of the first studies that I began was in this book, Jim Jones, The Malachi 4 Elijah Prophecy. I was just curious for myself, how many other people claim to be Elijah? And I was a little shocked when I learned how many there were, but then the question began to form, how many of those were in direct succession leading up to William Branham? And obviously, John Alexander Dowie is the biggest one. He was the most famous Elijah that I'll probably say has ever existed since the original Elijah, and he might have been more famous than the original Elijah. John Alexander Dowie was the American Elijah. He was the prototype. When he began to lose control of he had to annex an entire city for his cult of personality. And when he lost control of that city, there were millions of dollars flowing through this. So you had this sudden swarm of other men who wanted to, quote unquote, claim the mantle of Elijah. And they didn't call it that back then, but that's essentially what it was. One of the men who came was Charles Fox Parham, and he actually seized control of Zion City, at least part of it, for a period of time before they ran him out. But there's this clear succession of Elijah men. Jim Jones, he was in this message cult. He learned from Branham, and then you can find some, it's mentioned in the book, I don't have it in front of me, you can find some quotes where people in his divine healing lines are talking to him as Elijah. So there is a succession of men. There were many people. This was not anything new. And there's this one newspaper article that I'll pull up for the video. It's titled "The Religious Grafter," and it reads, "Of all the grafters, the religious grafter, or the self-appointed Messiah, or Elijah, or Daniel, or Israel, or Adam, is the meanest. The religious graft is also one of the most profitable, and hitherto has been comparatively safe con games to play. From the time immemorial, smooth-tongued, conscienceless individual has been able to gather about him a lot of weak-minded people who were prepared to accept as gospel truth all that he said and was willing to do all that he commanded them to do, even to discarding clothing and living as the savages lived." So this was a problem that was so widespread, men claiming to be Elijah and these other names. This was such a problem that in 1911, this article is dated 1911. As early as 1911, there had been so many that at least this journalist said, we've had enough. There are so many con men out there. When are you people going to wake up and realize that when somebody makes this claim, they're probably out to get you? And Charles, I can assure you, if you were to suddenly claim to be Elijah and go into a church service somewhere and stand up and say, God spoke through me and said, I am Elijah the prophet, follow me. Most people are not going to follow you. They have to be first manipulated to believe you, then brainwashed, then they follow you.
Right. That's well said. You know, that's what William Branham did himself, right? Like, he didn't come on saying, hey, I'm Elijah, guys, come follow me. He spent decades and years out doing his stuff and then kind of introduced that publicly, you know, as time went by. But yeah, the idea, you know, that this Elijah is going to come back and all the people that claimed it, that is a really big topic. more than we can, fully digest right here. But I'll try to give just a quick overview too. The idea that Elijah would return has been around for a really long time. I mean, it goes back to Judaism itself. Judaism itself expects the return of Elijah before the end of days. So, that idea preexists even Christianity. So it's a really old idea. That's how the Old Testament ends, right? Basically, Elijah's coming back. That's how the Jewish Old Testament ends. So it's a really old idea. And if you were tracing how it came into the message, you got to go back to the 1700s. John Darby took that Malachi 4 prophecy and he began applying it to one of the two witnesses of Revelation, believing that Elijah would come back, at the end of days. And he taught that he would be coming back to Israel, to national Israel, to the Jewish people, but not to the church. Because obviously the Malachi 4 prophecy is to Israel, not to the church. So no matter what you do, it's kind of hard to twist it and apply it to the Gentiles. So he broke it up into the 2 days. There's the great and dreadful day, and then the dreadful day is the second coming. The great is the first. So very similar to the message, except he applied the second one to the two witnesses of Revelation. Well, British Israelism picked up some of Darby's ideas, right? British Israelite preachers began incorporating some of that as you come through the 1800s, and of course, they thought they were Israel, right? And so now Elijah's not coming to the Jewish people, now Elijah's coming to them. And this is how you get in the frame of mind that an Elijah is going to come to the church. It's at the point in time that British Israelites think that they are Israel and they are the church. And so as that happens, that's when you start getting all this glut of Elijah showing up. Alexander Dowie is the first one that I know of, starting in the 1870s. He's a big British Israelite. He's been influenced by this stuff, and he starts presenting himself as Elijah around the turn of the century. John Sanford started doing the same thing. He started presenting himself as Elijah. He was also British Israelite. Then the next one I know of that, that was prominent was Charles Parham, really the founder of Pentecostalism, honestly. He claimed to be the Elijah after Dowie died. Then after Parham died, John Lake claimed to be Elijah, which John Lake was also British Israelite. All these guys are British Israelites, and the British Israelite framework that allowed for the idea of an Elijah returning to a church which was made up of Israelites, okay? Now, the message eventually lost, and Pentecostalism itself ultimately rejected, the idea that they were the 10 lost tribes of Israel, but they keep some of these prophecies hanging around, right? That are left over from the influence of British Israelism. And the influence of British Israelism on the message especially is hard to overstate. I would say this is one of the biggest kept secrets, is just how influential this British Israel ideology has been, and honestly the corrupting influence it had on the teachings of the message, because obviously they were not Israel, therefore they misinterpreted that prophecy one way or the other. So you've got that. And so besides those British Israelite guys, there were other guys who were also famous, that went on and really influenced the Christian identity movement, who also insinuated or claimed to be Elijah. Howard Rand, Arnold Leith, John Smith Pigot, they're moderately famous British Israelites who insinuated that. And like I said, those guys were fairly influential in the formation of Christian identity theology. And so if you added up all of the guys I know of, there were somewhere around 15 different British Israelite guys who claimed to be Elijah between 1870 and 1950, William Branham being in a direct line of succession from those people.